Is what we're seeing right now in the Middle East and experiencing around the world the start of Jacob's trouble? If so, most of us are missing the signs, aren't we? Now, you may be thinking to yourself, well, so what? It's Jacob's trouble. Who cares? It's not my trouble, my church's trouble, or even Nelson's trouble. Jacob is Israel's original name, so you might be thinking, yeah, I care about Israel, but ultimately, it's not my trouble, is it? It's Israel's trouble. But Jesus wants us to know it's going to be something that's going to affect us all, regardless of where we live or what our genetics are. Jesus said in Matthew 24:21, "For then there will be great tribulation, and has not been from the beginning of the world," the whole world, not just Israel, "until now, no, and never will be." And the great tribulation is part of Jacob's trouble. It's going to impact all of us. This is Bible teacher Nelson Walters, and today we're going to show that the first stages of Jacob's trouble, the world's ultimate crisis, has indeed begun according to the Bible. That means what occurred last year in Israel with the group that we call Hammy is part of it. The protests against Israel in the nations and universities, that's part of it. But it goes back even further. But before we show you why we think that way, just speaking of trouble and crisis probably makes you wonder why God, in his infinite wisdom, justice, mercy, and grace, would desire a time of trouble or tribulation at all. Let's start by looking at Deuteronomy 4 first, because this is where the concept is first introduced. God had just rescued Israel from the Egyptians, given them the law at Mount Sinai, and after 40 years of wandering, Israel was ready to enter the land and become a nation. But God warned them that they would depart from him again and again. But then he ends this way, and this is what I want you to pay attention to in Deuteronomy 4:30 through 31. "When you are in tribulation, and all these things come upon you in the latter days." This is speaking of a time of Jacob's trouble in the end times. And all these things are what Jesus defines for us in the Olivet Discourse. Remember him quoting this in the fig tree parable, Matthew 24:33, "When you see all these things, know that he is near at the very gates." So Jesus is eventually going to tell Israel what all these things are. And after that, Moses gives us the payoff. "You will return to the Lord your God and obey his voice. For the Lord your God is a merciful God." Here's that word mercy. "And he will not leave you or destroy you or forget the covenant with your fathers that he swore to them." God gives them and us the tribulation of the last days to bring Israel and his other wayward sons back to him. Notice God says it is an act of mercy because, temporary tribulation, even death, are better than the second eternal death. God knows only this final, ultimate crisis will bring all his children home, those who profess Christ and those who don't, at least yet. Israel and all of God's wayward children will not return to him unless they pass through the time of tribulation and trouble. Now, preterists and historicists will say, hey, wait a minute, this all happened in AD 70 or during the Holocaust. Not so, because Israel has yet to return to the Lord and obey his voice. They still don't recognize who he is, and that, of course, is Jesus. So these times were just foreshadows of what is still coming. The major crisis is still not complete, but when did it start? We need to look at the prophet Jeremiah next, because that is where we get this name, Jacob's trouble, and where we get a hint of where it begins. God tells him of a coming time of distress in Jeremiah 30, 5 through 6. These are the words that the Lord spoke concerning Israel and Judah. Notice it's both houses, both kingdoms yet. Jeremiah prophesied 100 years after Israel was taken into captivity, and the 10 lost tribes became lost. But this prophecy is still for them, because part of what God is going to do is restore the entire nation, northern and southern, all 12 tribes. Let's continue. Thus says the Lord, we heard of a cry of panic, of terror, and no peace. Notice, we heard. It's plural. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit have heard. We heard a cry of panic, of terror, and no peace. Remember, Jeremiah prophesied about the false prophets who cry peace when there is no peace. And God is reiterating that, saying, hey, during this time, there is no peace. Let's keep going. Ask now and see, can a man bear a child? The obvious answer is no. Although some in our crazy world might want to try, with all the trans ideas that are going on. But let's get back to the verse. Why then do I see every man with his hands on his stomach like a woman in labor? Why has every face turned pale? Here God compares the coming trouble to labor pains. And yes, you're right, Jesus spoke of this as well, and we'll get to that in a second, but let's finish the section. Alas, that day is great. There is none like it. It is the time of Jacob's trouble. Yet he shall be saved out of it. Israel and God's other lost children will go through a time of trouble, but they're going to be saved out of it. Or as the Hebrew word min can also mean, on account of it, or because of the trial, they will be saved. And here's the payoff. Jeremiah gives us what the spiritual saving actually looks like. Jeremiah 31 through 34. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Did you notice again? It's both houses. Even though the house of Israel was still lost among the nations, and this is the new covenant. Yes, the one that Jesus bought with his blood on the cross. You might want to send this passage to your pastor and ask him how, if this covenant is made with Israel and Judah, how your church lives under the new covenant now. It would be very interesting to hear his answer. Okay, back to Jeremiah 31. Not like the covenant I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people, and no longer shall each one teach his neighbor, and each his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sins no more. Has this been fulfilled? Do the houses of Israel and Judah know God from the least to the greatest? No, they don't. Not yet. Preterists and historicists, please take notice. But the ultimate payoff is the new covenant. Now, I imagine you notice the portion of this passage about the time of Jacob's trouble being like labor pains of a woman. We kind of made a joke and went on. But when God asks, can a man bear a child? The answer is no. He's telling us this part is an analogy. And everywhere we see this analogy in the Bible of labor pains, it's speaking of this same time. Jesus spoke of this time in the Olivet Discourse when he told us that certain events like war, famine, pestilence, earthquakes, or other shakings, those would be the beginning of birth pangs. And he described that more severe pains would come later. This is the same thing God was describing to Jeremiah as Jacob's trouble. It's the same time. I bet that mention of labor pains also reminds you of another place that it appears in Revelation 12, the birth pains that are suffered by a character known as the woman. And here's where we're going to get to the point of when it starts. So if that's what interests you, this is where we pay strict attention. And labor pains, are supposed to remind you that it's the same time. And in a series of signs in the heavens, God paints the picture of Jacob's trouble in the night sky. Let's look at the passage in Revelation 12, 1 through 6. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. So God gave us a great sign that the pregnancy birth pains were beginning. But unfortunately, this sign was grossly misinterpreted, and so God's great sign has been ignored. We know this as the sign of the woman in labor in Virgo, and it happened in September 2017. Nearly the entire Christian world knew about this sign, but everybody thought it was going to be a sign of the rapture. When it wasn't, everyone moved on to the next big thing, not realizing this was a big thing, a great sign, as we're told by God through the Apostle John. So what does it mean? The beginning of the birth pains and the beginning of Jacob's trouble. That's what it means. Then a second sign will appear. So goes Revelation 12. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems. His tail swept 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth, and the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. This sign hasn't happened yet. It will mark the casting out of heaven of Satan and his evil angels who make up 1/3 of the total. That will happen right around the time of the abomination of desolation. Then comes sign number 3. She gave birth to a male child, one who's to rule the nations with a rod of iron, but her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1260 days. So there are 2 things in this sign. One truly is the rapture of God's elect, who place their faith in Jesus. God protects some of his children that way, catching them up to God's throne. We see that in Revelation 7:16. We see them before his throne. Now, those who are of the house of Judah, however, who do not have faith, he hides in the wilderness for 1260 days, or time, times, and half a time. This is the same idea as Jesus telling those in Judah to escape to the mountains in Matthew 24:15 through 16. We already talked about that. Now, you already know one of these astronomical signs, I'm sure. The woman in labor in Virgo from September 2017. You probably went out at night to see it. I did. But you may have questions about the authenticity of that sign. You also might not realize that 3 other signs are yet to appear that mark the dragon being cast down, the sign of the rapture, and the catching away to God's throne. There's even another sign of the crushing of the head of a serpent. At the end of this teaching, we're not there yet, but at the end, we have a link to a video that explains all these signs. But the takeaway for now is that the birth pangs began right at the Feast of Trumpets in 2017. We have had 7 years of birth pains so far. The pandemic, wars in Europe and Middle East, and soon, we think, a major financial crisis, etc. So we are in Jacob's trouble and the birth pains. But there's still a lot of things that we haven't seen. We're only halfway there. One thing Jeremiah describes for us, however, is no peace. Prophets who say peace when there is no peace. What Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5:3, people are saying, there is peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them as labor pains, there it is again, come upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. This is Jacob's trouble. So the really bad stuff begins with peace. And we don't have that yet. The world has never seen this type of peace, but it's coming. Revelation 6, there are 4 horses of the apocalypse, white, red, black, and speckled green, standing for false peace, bloodshed, economic distress, and death and pestilence. But peace comes first. So we're in the midst of ceasefire negotiations. Think about that. And what comes first? False peace. The white horse. And we know the UN covenant for the future, likely the covenant with the many, is coming on the Feast of Trumpets this year, exactly 7 years from the sign of the woman in labor of 2017 that was also right after the Feast of Trumpets. That's the next step. Is this ceasefire related to Jacob's trouble as well? It is. Let's explain. The term Jacob's trouble itself comes from Genesis 35, 1 through 4. God said to Jacob, "Arise, go to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar there to God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau." 3 verses later, that passage describes this day as having been the day of Jacob's distress or trouble. The same Hebrew word found in Jeremiah, in Jacob's trouble. So running from Esau, whose people were later called Edom, was the day the initial Jacob's trouble started. Now, Judah's going to run to the mountains as Jesus described, so there will be another day with a running just like that. And in another of our popular videos, we described how the book of Psalms describes the formation of the 10 horns of the beast, the inner core of his empire. These horns are 10 kings who will rule a nation that will surround Israel on all sides, a ring of fire all around them. Why is that important? Well, one of these groups is Edom, the same guys Jacob ran from, same guys he's going to run from again. 2 other groups in this group of 10 are in the news right now. Hammy, that we've already described to you, and this one, Hezi. So the 10 horns are like forming as we speak. So those are 3 of the 10 people groups who surrounded Israel and will be ruled by 10 kings. That is a sign. 1 nation, 10 kings. Now you may say, hey, wait a minute. I have my own ideas about who the 10 kings are, and I bet you do. I had my own understanding too at one time. But we're not to trust in our own understanding. But we're to trust in the Lord and His Word with all our hearts. So, in this popular teaching about who those kings are, we show you how the Apostle John quotes this psalm in the book of Revelation in regard to these same 10 kings, proving that this passage in Psalm is the one he was referring to about those kings. But you need to see it for yourself. So click right here to keep watching, or click over here to watch the video about the exact dates the star signs of the end will appear and how we will know these are the signs, or watch them both. Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you either here or there.